The remains of 215 children were found buried at a former BC residential school. Flags on federal buildings were lowered in memory of those school victims. This is the Great White North Report. Over the weekend, the remains of 215 children were found buried at a former BC residential school, according to First Nations. Now, the First Nations said the remains were confirmed last weekend near the city of Kamloops, hired a specialist in ground-penetrating radar to carry out the work, and that their language and culture department oversaw the project to ensure it was done in a culturally appropriate and respectful way. Now, to our knowledge, these missing children are undocumented deaths, which doesn't surprise me. Some were as young as 3 years old. We sought a way to confirm that, knowing out of the deepest respect and love for their lost children and their families. Now, what puzzles me is if there's 217 missing children, why didn't their families speak out before that they were missing? These kids have been missing for a lot of years. Why didn't their parents look for them? But this is definitely a tragedy, and this was something that happened at the residential schools a lot. This particular residential school was in operation until 1969. The idea now is to contact the students' home communities and protect the remains, and working with museums to find records of these deaths. So they're going to have to go through all the archives with a comb. I would also do DNA testing to find out where these kids are from, because a lot of these kids are also from different tribes or regions of BC. They don't all come from one reservation. Many of them are mixed. Now, this school was in operation from 1890 to 69 and was finally closed in 78. And it says that up to 500 students would have been registered at the school, according to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And they would have come from First Nations across BC and beyond. Now, they were first told that 50 deaths occurred at the Kamloops institution. Obviously, that's a lie if they find 215. And I believe that the people running those schools were afraid of retribution. So they downplayed it, or they just didn't know. So that's a lot of years to be keeping track of something. What bothers me is that these kids died and were not taken back to their communities at the time of death. So I'm pretty shocked and disgusted by the whole episode. I'm never a fan of the residential school. And if it had been up to me, I wouldn't have done it. You know, the time and place. And it's a shameful part of Canadian history. They assume that 150,000 children attended residential schools in Canada from the 1830s up until the last school closed in 1996. So we had this policy right up until the Chrétien years. That's how long this shameful period lasted. They figured that 4,100 children died at these schools based on death records. True total is likely much higher. Obviously, if you find 215 in one place when there's only supposed to be 50, that makes sense. Somewhere like 3% of the kids died. So in response, the Canadian flag at the Peace Tower in Ottawa was lowered at half-mast on Sunday following the discovery of the bodies. And according to the Department of Canadian Heritage, all federal buildings and establishments would also be lower their flags until further notice, in memory of the thousands of children who were sent to residential schools. For those who never returned, in honor of the families whose lives were changed forever, because it was a terrible policy. I think we should have every provincial capital and the federal capital, Ottawa, should have its own memorial with the names of all those children who died inscribed in stone, and find out as much as we can about them. It's a shameful part of our history, and I wish it never happened, but it did. So why did Canada set up the residential schools? There were already schools in place run by the Jesuits and other missionary groups, but they weren't as bad as these. It was a school system set up by the Canadian government and administered by churches that had the nominal objective of educating Indigenous children, but unfortunately, more damaging, it had the explicit objective of indoctrinating them into the Euro-Canadian and Christian way of living and assimilating them into the mainstream of white Canadian society. This is the shameful part. It forcibly separated children from their families for extended periods of time and forbade them to acknowledge their Indigenous heritage and culture or to speak their own languages, which is why they moved different groups of kids from, say, Alberta over to BC and so forth. They intermixed the different tribals. So none of these kids had a common language. So let's say you had 100 kids in a residential school, only a certain percentage would have a common language. And many of them were tribal rivals. It was an effort to break down. Punishments were harsh, but then again, that's the time period. Punishment was harsh. It was run like try checking out an orphanage. Orphanages were also harsh places to be in. Physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse. Provide inappropriate education, often only up to lower grades, that focus mainly on prayer and manual labor and agricultural light industry, such as woodworking, and domestic work, such as laundry work and sewing. So did it prepare the Indigenous peoples, students, kids? Not really, only as lower level citizens. or poor citizens. Basically, we thought of the native population as being savage, would be one word, ignorant, like children in need of guidance. That was how it was looked at from the 1600s, right from colonization up to now. Now, they felt the need to civilize indigenous peoples. Education, federal responsibility, became the primary means of this end. So, Prime Minister at the time, Sir John A. Macdonald, and no, I'm not going to tear his statues down for this, he commissioned a journalist and politician, Nicholas Flood Davin, to study the industrial schools for indigenous kids in the United States. He recommended following the U.S. example of aggressive civilization, and it led to public funding for the residential school system. The idea was to educate and convert indigenous youth to assimilate them into Canadian society. There were roughly 130 residential schools operating between 1831 and 1996. This is before Canada was even a country. This is under the British rule. In 1931, there were 80 residential schools operating in Canada, the most at any one time. The first one was opened at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, 1831. And the Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan was closed in 1996, the last federally funded residential school. So residential schools was nothing new. It had been developed in New France by Catholic missionaries and continued by Anglican, Methodist, and Roman Catholic institutions in Upper Canada. It was a continuation of the policy, which was a total and abject failure. Now, the idea was they supported schooling as a way to make the First Nations economically self-sufficient, nothing wrong with that, and they were to decrease Indigenous dependence on public funds. So there's nothing wrong with self-sufficiency and get their dependence away from public funds, but it led to a development of the educational policy that relied heavily on custodial schools, and it was not what Indigenous leaders had hoped to create. The native Indigenous peoples also, they wanted residential schools as well, because they could see their way of life quickly eroding, especially on the plains with the decrease in the buffalo herds and starvation looking at them in the face. They wanted their kids to adapt in a new world, and they saw the residential schools as a good thing, but they disagreed with how the government did it, but were powerless to do much about it. So they did want it, but they didn't like how it was done. And when you allow government to do something like that, if anything, the Indigenous people should have ran the schools, but hired government teachers. That would have been the best way to do it, and then eventually integrate. But they never did that until later on. Do I consider it a form of genocide? Yes. Is it because it was a purposeful attempt from the government and church to eradicate all aspects of Indigenous culture and life worlds? In other words, change them. Now, we began to acknowledge this back in the 90s. And in 2008, under Harper, the Canadian government issued a formal apology in Parliament for all the damage done. However, these things happen, and it's unfortunate. So like I said, I'd like to see a big memorial to these kids. It won't bring them back, and it won't bring anything, and we can do better for our Indigenous population right now. Does this stuff happen elsewhere in the world? Yes. Look no further than China. In China, the Uyghur Muslims are in concentration camps. The Mongolians of the Inner Mongolian province are not allowed to speak their own language. In Tibet, Tibetan culture is not allowed. So this thing still happens this happens in the world, and it's happened over and over again throughout the world. It's nothing new. That doesn't make it right, but hopefully we can learn from our mistake and never let this happen again. I feel sorry for all these kids that had to go through this bull, and it is a shameful part of our history. But we should learn from it and move on. We should definitely go back to all the residential schools and look underground, see what's going on, go through their archives with a fine tooth, and search the grounds to see what else is there. Anyway, any Canadians out there, let me know what you guys think of the residential school system, and what can we do to honor the dead. Until next time, this has been the Great White North Report.